My name is Margaret Thompson, and I am 67 years old. For 43 years, I have carried a secret so devastating that it has shaped every decision I have made, every word I have spoken, and every sacrifice I have endured. Today, as I sit in this empty house surrounded by the echoes of ungrateful voices and the weight of unspoken truths, I finally understand that silence has been both my shield and my prison. The morning everything changed began like any other Tuesday in March 1981. I was 24, married to David for 3 years, and we had been trying to conceive for 18 months. The doctor's appointment was supposed to bring us hope, answers, maybe even good news. Instead, it brought me a truth that would define the rest of my life. Dr. Harrison's office smelled of antiseptic and false promises. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he delivered words that seemed to float in the air before crashing down upon me like stones. Severe endometriosis, extensive scarring. The chances of natural conception were virtually impossible. Even with medical intervention, the likelihood remained devastatingly low. David held my hand as the doctor explained treatment options, but I could barely hear him over the sound of my world crumbling. I watched my husband's face change as the reality sank in. The man who had dreamed of teaching his son to play baseball and walking his daughter down the aisle was learning that these dreams might never come true. That evening, David tried to be supportive, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. He suggested we explore other options, perhaps adoption, but his voice lacked conviction. I knew then that our marriage had received a wound that might never heal. 3 months later, everything changed again. David's sister Rachel called with news that would alter the course of my entire existence. She was pregnant, unmarried, and desperate. At 19, she had made a mistake with a man who disappeared the moment she told him about the pregnancy. She was considering having an abortion, but the shame and fear were overwhelming her. Rachel had always been the wild one in David's family, the one who made impulsive decisions and lived for the moment, but now, faced with the consequences of her choices, she was terrified and alone. Her parents had always been strict, religious people who would never accept an illegitimate grandchild. She knew that telling them would result in her being disowned completely. As I listened to her tearful confession over the phone, something inside me began to shift. Here was a young woman carrying a child she could not keep. And here was I, a woman who desperately wanted a child but could not have one. The universe seemed to be presenting us with a solution that was both miraculous and terrifying. I found myself suggesting something that surprised even me. What if Rachel came to stay with us during her pregnancy? What if we told everyone she was helping me through a difficult time? What if, when the baby was born, we could adopt it legally and give it the loving home it deserved? Rachel was silent for a long moment, and I could hear her breathing heavily on the other end of the line. Then, through her tears, she whispered that it might be the answer to both our prayers. She could finish her pregnancy without shame, and David and I could finally have the family we had always dreamed of. David was hesitant at first, worried about the legal implications and the family dynamics, but as we talked through the possibilities, he began to see the potential for healing that this arrangement might bring. We could help his sister while fulfilling our own deepest desires. It seemed like a perfect solution to an impossible situation. Within a week, Rachel had moved into our spare bedroom, and we began the elaborate charade that would define the next 4 decades of my life. We told everyone that she was helping me recover from a procedure related to my condition. We said she needed a change of scenery, and that we enjoyed having her company. No one questioned the story, and Rachel's pregnancy remained our secret. As the months passed, I found myself becoming more and more invested in the pregnancy. I accompanied Rachel to her doctor appointments, helped her choose maternity clothes, and even felt the baby kick for the first time. In many ways, I was experiencing the pregnancy I had always wanted. Even though the child was not biologically mine, Rachel seemed to thrive under our care. She ate well, took her vitamins, and even seemed to enjoy the attention that came with being pregnant. But I could see the sadness in her eyes sometimes, the knowledge that she would have to give up her child. I tried to reassure her that this was the best decision for everyone, but I knew she was struggling with the reality of what we were planning. The birth was both the most joyful and most heartbreaking day of my life. Rachel labored for 14 hours, and I was there holding her hand through every contraction. When Thomas David Thompson finally entered the world, screaming and perfect, I felt a love so intense it took my breath away. This was my son, the child I had prayed for and dreamed of for so long. But as I looked at Rachel holding her newborn baby, I saw something in her eyes that terrified me. It was love, pure and overwhelming, the kind of love that makes a mother willing to sacrifice everything for her child. In that moment, I realized that our carefully planned arrangement might not be as simple as we had imagined. The legal adoption process went smoothly, with Rachel signing all the necessary papers and officially relinquishing her parental rights. David and I became Thomas's legal parents, and to the outside world, we had finally been blessed with the child we had always wanted. But inside our home, the reality was much more complicated. Rachel stayed with us for 6 weeks after the birth, helping with the baby and recovering from the delivery. I watched her interact with Thomas, and I could see the internal struggle she was fighting. She loved him desperately, but she also knew that David and I could provide him with opportunities and stability that she could never offer. When she finally left to return to her own life, I thought our secret would be safe forever. Thomas would grow up as our son, never knowing the truth about his biological mother. Rachel would move on with her life, and we would all live happily ever after. I was naive to believe that secrets this big could remain buried forever. The first few years of Thomas's life were everything I had dreamed they would be. He was a healthy, happy baby who filled our home with laughter and joy. David embraced fatherhood with enthusiasm, spending hours teaching Thomas to walk, talking to him in silly voices, and proudly showing him off to anyone who would listen. To everyone around us, we appeared to be the perfect family we had always wanted to be. But Rachel's presence in our lives was more complicated than I had anticipated. She visited frequently, always under the guise of being the doting aunt who loved to spoil her nephew. She brought gifts, helped with babysitting, and seemed to genuinely enjoy watching Thomas grow and develop. On the surface, everything appeared normal and healthy. However, I began to notice subtle signs that concerned me. Rachel would hold Thomas just a little too long, stare at him with an intensity that made me uncomfortable, and sometimes make comments about his features that seemed too knowing, too personal. She would say things like he had her eyes, or that his smile reminded her of herself as a child. These observations were innocent enough to casual listeners, but they filled me with a growing anxiety. When Thomas was 2 years old, Rachel met someone new. James was a good man, stable and kind, who worked as a teacher at the local elementary school. They began dating seriously, and I found myself both relieved and worried about this development. I was happy that Rachel was moving forward with her life, but I also feared what might happen if James learned the truth about Thomas. My fears were realized one evening when Rachel called me in tears. She had been spending more time with James, and their relationship was becoming serious. She was considering telling him about Thomas, about the secret we had been keeping for 2 years. She felt guilty about building a relationship based on deception, and she wondered if James would accept the truth if she shared it with him. I found myself in the impossible position of having to convince Rachel to maintain our deception. I reminded her of all the reasons why we had made this arrangement in the first place. Thomas was happy and thriving. David and I were providing him with a stable, loving home. Rachel was free to pursue her own life and happiness without the burden of single motherhood. Revealing the truth now would only cause pain and confusion for everyone involved. Rachel agreed to keep our secret, but I could see that the weight of it was beginning to affect her. She became more withdrawn during her visits, and I noticed that she seemed to struggle with the boundary between aunt and mother. She would correct me when I disciplined Thomas, offer unsolicited advice about his care, and sometimes make comments that suggested she felt she had more right to make decisions about his upbringing than I did. The situation became more complicated when Thomas turned 3 and began attending preschool. He was a bright, curious child who asked endless questions about everything around him. One day, he came home from school asking about families and how babies were made. The teacher had read them a book about where babies come from, and Thomas was full of questions about his own birth. David and I had discussed this moment many times, and we had prepared a story that was truthful enough to satisfy a young child's curiosity without revealing the full truth. We told him that sometimes mommies and daddies need help from doctors to have babies, and that he was our special miracle baby that we had waited for and wanted very much. Thomas seemed satisfied with this explanation, but his questions made me realize that our secret was not just about protecting Rachel's reputation or our own desires. It was about Thomas's identity, his right to know who he really was and where he came from. For the first time, I began to question whether we were doing the right thing by keeping the truth from him. When Thomas was 4, Rachel announced that she and James were getting married. I was genuinely happy for her, but I was also terrified about what this meant for our secret. A marriage would mean sharing everything with James, and I worried that Rachel might eventually feel compelled to tell him the truth about Thomas. The wedding was beautiful, and Thomas served as the ring bearer. Watching him walk down the aisle, in his tiny tuxedo, I felt a mixture of pride and sadness. He was growing up so quickly, and with each passing day, the truth about his origins seemed to become more complex and more difficult to reveal. Rachel and James settled into married life, and I hoped that her happiness would help her move past any regrets about giving up Thomas. For a while, it seemed like my hopes were justified. Rachel visited less frequently, and when she did come, she seemed more at peace with the role of aunt rather than struggling with the suppressed identity of mother. But when Thomas was 5, Rachel made an announcement that changed everything. She and James were expecting a baby. As I watched her glow with excitement about her pregnancy, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. I was happy for her, but I was also terrified about what this might mean for Thomas and our secret. The pregnancy seemed to awaken something in Rachel that had been dormant for years. She began talking more openly about motherhood, about the bonds between mothers and children, and about the importance of truth in families. She started making comments about how children deserved to know their real parents and how keeping secrets from children was ultimately harmful to them. I tried to deflect these conversations, but Rachel's newfound passion for honesty was making me increasingly uncomfortable. She would look at Thomas with a longing that was becoming harder to disguise, and I could see that her pregnancy was making her question the decision we had made 5 years earlier, when Rachel's daughter Emma was born. The situation became even more complex. Thomas was fascinated by his new cousin and wanted to spend as much time with her as possible. He would ask why Emma looked so much like Aunt Rachel when he didn't look like me or David. He wondered why Emma had Rachel's dark hair and brown eyes when his were light blue, and why their facial features seemed so similar. I found myself making up explanations about genetics and family resemblances. But Thomas was becoming old enough to notice inconsistencies in my stories. He was a bright child who paid attention to details, and I could see that he was beginning to piece together information that didn't quite add up. The breaking point came when Thomas was 6 years old. He had been asking more questions about his birth, about why he didn't have any baby pictures in the hospital, and about why he couldn't remember Rachel being around when he was very young. I had run out of satisfactory explanations, and I could see that he was beginning to suspect that something was not quite right about his origin story. One afternoon, while I was babysitting Emma, Thomas overheard me talking to her in a way that seemed different from how I usually spoke to children. I was more natural, more relaxed, and Thomas noticed the difference. He asked me why I acted differently with Emma than I did with him, and I realized that maintaining our secret was becoming increasingly difficult as he grew older and more perceptive. That evening, I called Rachel and told her that we needed to talk. The weight of our secret was becoming unbearable, and I was beginning to fear that Thomas would discover the truth on his own, which would be far more damaging than if we found a way to tell him ourselves. But Rachel was not ready to face that conversation, and she begged me to maintain our silence for a little longer. I agreed, but I knew that our time was running out. Thomas was growing up, and with each passing day, the truth was becoming more complicated and more painful to reveal. I had thought that keeping our secret would protect everyone involved, but I was beginning to realize that it might be causing more harm than good. The next few years passed in a delicate balance of half-truths and careful omissions. Thomas continued to grow into a remarkable child, excelling in school and showing a natural talent for music that neither David nor I possessed. He was curious about everything, especially about his own identity, and I found myself becoming increasingly creative in my explanations for the questions he asked. When Thomas was 8, he started asking more specific questions about his birth. He had been born in a hospital in the next town over, and he wanted to know why we had chosen to go there instead of the local hospital, where all his friends had been born. I told him that the doctor there was a specialist who helped parents, like us, who had trouble having babies naturally, which was true enough to satisfy him for a while. But Thomas was becoming more observant and more persistent in his questioning. He noticed that I didn't have the same pregnancy stories that other mothers shared, and he asked why I never talked about being pregnant with him, or what it felt like when he kicked inside me. I found myself having to create elaborate stories about my pregnancy, borrowing details from friends' experiences, and hoping that Thomas wouldn't notice the inconsistencies. Rachel's life was becoming more complicated as well. She and James had settled into parenthood with Emma, and she was struggling with the dual role of being Emma's mother while maintaining the pretense of being only Thomas's aunt. I could see the strain it was putting on her marriage, as she had to constantly be careful about what she said and how she acted around Thomas. James was a perceptive man, and I began to worry that he was starting to notice the unusual dynamics in our family. He would comment on how much Thomas seemed to mean to Rachel, and how she seemed to have strong opinions about his upbringing and education. He started asking questions about Rachel's relationship with David and me, and why she was so involved in Thomas's life. The situation became even more complicated when Thomas was 9 and started showing signs of behavioral problems at school. He was having difficulty concentrating, was acting out with other children, and seemed to be struggling with feelings of anger and confusion that he couldn't explain. His teacher suggested that he might benefit from counseling, and I found myself in the terrifying position of having to consider whether his problems might be related to the secret we were keeping. David and I took Thomas to see a child psychologist, Dr. Martinez, who specialized in helping children work through emotional difficulties. During their sessions, Thomas began talking about feeling different from other children, about having dreams that didn't make sense, and about feeling like something important was missing from his life. Dr. Martinez suggested that Thomas might be picking up on family tensions or unspoken secrets that were affecting his emotional development. She recommended family therapy sessions to help identify and address whatever underlying issues might be contributing to his behavioral problems. I agreed to the sessions, but I was terrified about what they might reveal. During our first family therapy session, Dr. Martinez asked us to talk about our family history and any significant events that might have affected Thomas's development. I found myself having to maintain our deception, even in this therapeutic setting. But I could see that Dr. Martinez was skilled at reading between the lines of what families told her. She asked specific questions about Thomas's early years, about his relationship with extended family members, and about any changes in our family dynamics that might have affected him. I tried to answer honestly, without revealing the truth, but I could see that she was beginning to suspect that there was more to our story than we were telling her. Thomas's behavioral problems continued to worsen, and I began to wonder if the secret we had been keeping was somehow affecting him on a subconscious level. Children are remarkably intuitive, and I worried that Thomas might be sensing the deception in our family, even if he couldn't consciously identify what was wrong. The crisis came when Thomas was 10 years old. He had been having nightmares about being lost and not being able to find his real parents. He would wake up crying and asking me questions about his birth that I could no longer answer convincingly. He started asking why he didn't look like David or me, why he had different interests and talents, and why he sometimes felt like he didn't belong in our family. One particularly difficult night, Thomas asked me directly if I was really his mother. He said that he had been thinking about it for a long time, and that nothing about his birth story made sense to him anymore. He wanted to know why we had gone to a different hospital, why he had no baby pictures at home, and why Rachel always looked at him with such sadness in her eyes. I was faced with a choice that I had been dreading for 10 years. I could continue to maintain our deception, hoping that Thomas would eventually stop asking questions and accept the story we had created, or I could find a way to tell him the truth, risking the destruction of everything we had built together as a family. I chose to maintain the lie, telling Thomas that sometimes children go through phases where they question their identity, and that his feelings were normal. I assured him that David and I were indeed his parents, and that we loved him more than anything in the world. But I could see in his eyes that he was no longer convinced by my explanations. The next few months were incredibly difficult for our entire family. Thomas became withdrawn and sullen, and his problems at school escalated. He was getting into fights with other children, his grades were dropping, and he seemed to be angry at the world in general. David and I were struggling to help him, but we felt helpless against a problem that we couldn't fully address without revealing the truth. Rachel was also struggling with the situation. She could see that Thomas was in pain, and she felt responsible for his emotional turmoil. She started suggesting that maybe it was time to tell him the truth, that keeping the secret was causing more harm than good, but I was terrified about what revealing the truth might do to our family. And I convinced her to wait a little longer. Dr. Martinez continued to work with Thomas, and she started making more direct suggestions about the possibility of family secrets that might be affecting his emotional development. She recommended that we consider whether there might be information about Thomas's background that could help her understand his current struggles. I found myself in an impossible position. I wanted to help Thomas, but I was terrified that revealing the truth would destroy everything we had built together. I was also worried about how the truth might affect Rachel's marriage and Emma's relationship with her mother. The secret that had once seemed like a solution to everyone's problems had become a source of pain and confusion that was affecting every aspect of our lives. The decision about whether to reveal the truth was taken out of my hands when Thomas turned 11. He had been doing research on his own, looking through old family photographs and asking questions of relatives who might have information about his early years. He had become suspicious about the timeline of his birth and the story we had told him, and he was determined to find out the truth for himself. One day, Thomas came home from school with a look of determination that I had never seen before. He had been talking to his guidance counselor about his feelings of not belonging, and she had suggested that he might benefit from learning more about his family history. Thomas announced that he wanted to see his birth certificate and any other documents related to his birth. I tried to deflect his request, but Thomas was no longer the easily distracted child he had once been. He was becoming a young man who was determined to understand his own identity, and he was not going to be satisfied with vague explanations and half-truths anymore. That evening, I called Rachel and told her that we were running out of time. Thomas was actively investigating his own background, and it was only a matter of time before he discovered the truth on his own. We needed to decide how to handle the situation before it was taken out of our hands entirely. Rachel agreed to meet with David and me to discuss our options. As we sat around our kitchen table, the same place where we had made the original decision to keep Thomas's parentage secret, we tried to figure out how to undo 11 years of deception without destroying our family in the process. The meeting with Rachel and David was one of the most difficult conversations of my life. We sat in our kitchen, the same space where we had shared countless family meals with Thomas, and tried to figure out how to reveal a truth that would change everything he believed about himself and his place in our family. Rachel looked exhausted, and I could see that the weight of our secret had been affecting her more than I had realized. She told us that she had been having nightmares about Thomas discovering the truth on his own, and that she felt guilty every time she looked at Emma and realized that she could be a real mother to one child while having to pretend to be just an aunt to another. David was struggling with his own feelings about the situation. He had embraced fatherhood completely, and Thomas was his son in every way that mattered except biologically. But he was also beginning to understand that maintaining our deception was causing harm to everyone involved, including Thomas himself. We spent hours discussing different approaches to revealing the truth. Should we tell Thomas gradually, starting with the information that he was adopted and then later revealing that Rachel was his biological mother? Should we tell him everything at once, risking the shock but avoiding the prolonged confusion of partial truths? Should we involve Dr. Martinez in the process, using her expertise to help Thomas process the information? Each option seemed to have significant drawbacks. Thomas was already struggling with feelings of not belonging, and learning that his entire identity had been built on a lie would likely make those feelings worse. But continuing to keep the secret seemed equally damaging, as it was preventing him from understanding himself and was causing ongoing emotional distress. Rachel was adamant that we needed to tell Thomas the truth, but she was also terrified about how it might affect her relationship with him and with Emma. She worried that Thomas might feel betrayed by her for giving him up, or that he might want to come live with her and James, disrupting the life she had built with her husband and daughter. I found myself in the position of having to advocate for continued secrecy, not because I thought it was the right thing to do, but because I was terrified of losing Thomas. He was my son in every way that mattered to me, and I couldn't bear the thought that learning the truth might make him love me less or want to leave our family. David took a more practical approach to the discussion. He pointed out that Thomas was already showing signs of emotional distress that seemed to be related to our secrets. His behavioral problems, his nightmares, and his persistent questioning suggested that he was already being harmed by the deception. David argued that telling him the truth, while painful, might actually help him understand himself better and resolve some of the confusion he was experiencing. After hours of discussion, we reached a decision that satisfied none of us completely, but seemed like the least harmful option available. We would tell Thomas the truth about his adoption, but we would frame it in a way that emphasized how much he was wanted and loved by everyone involved. We would explain that Rachel had been very young and unable to care for a baby, and that she had chosen us to be his parents because she knew we would love him and provide him with a good life. We decided to wait until the weekend to have this conversation, giving ourselves time to prepare and to think through how to present the information in the most supportive way possible. We also agreed that we would all be present when we told him, so that he could ask questions and get answers from everyone involved. The days leading up to our planned conversation were some of the most stressful of my life. I found myself watching Thomas more carefully, trying to memorize the way he looked at me with complete trust and love, knowing that this might be the last time I would see that innocent affection in his eyes. I was terrified that learning the truth would change his feelings about me and about our family. Thomas seemed to sense that something was different in our household. He asked me several times if everything was okay, and why Rachel had been visiting more frequently than usual. He also commented that David seemed distracted and that I had been acting nervous around him. I tried to reassure him that everything was fine, but I could see that he was not convinced. When Saturday morning arrived, we gathered in our living room with a formality that immediately put Thomas on alert. He sat in his favorite chair, looking between the three adults with growing concern. I could see that he knew something significant was about to happen, and his body language suggested that he was preparing himself for bad news. I had rehearsed what I was going to say dozens of times, but when the moment came, all my carefully planned words seemed inadequate. I started by telling Thomas how much we loved him and how proud we were of the young man he was becoming. I explained that we had something important to tell him about his birth, and that while it might be surprising, it didn't change how much he meant to all of us. Thomas listened quietly as I explained that he had been adopted as a baby, that Rachel was his biological mother, and that she had chosen David and me to be his parents because she wanted him to have the best life possible. I tried to emphasize that adoption was a loving choice that had brought him into our family, and that everyone involved had acted out of love for him. The silence that followed my explanation seemed to last forever. Thomas sat perfectly still, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. Then he turned to look at Rachel, then at David, then back at me. I could see him processing the information, trying to reconcile what I had just told him with everything he had believed about himself and his family. Finally, Thomas spoke, and his first words broke my heart. He asked me if this meant that I wasn't really his mother, and if David wasn't really his father. The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and I could see that despite our careful preparation, learning the truth was causing him exactly the kind of emotional devastation we had hoped to avoid. I tried to explain that being parents was about more than biology, that David and I had raised him and loved him, and that we were his real parents in every way that mattered. But I could see that Thomas was struggling to understand how the adults he trusted most had kept such a fundamental truth from him for his entire life. Rachel tried to explain her side of the story, telling Thomas that she had been very young and scared when she became pregnant, and that giving him to David and me had been the most difficult decision she had ever made. She assured him that she had thought about him every day since he was born, and that watching him grow up had been one of her greatest joys. But Thomas was not ready to hear explanations or reassurances. He was angry and confused, and he felt betrayed by everyone he had trusted. He accused us of lying to him his entire life, and he questioned whether anything we had ever told him about himself or his history was true. The conversation that followed was painful for everyone involved. Thomas asked difficult questions about why we had decided to keep the truth from him, whether other people in our family knew the secret, and how long we had planned to continue the deception. He wanted to know if Emma knew that Rachel was his mother, and whether James knew about the situation. I found myself having to admit that yes, other people in our family knew the truth, and that we had been actively deceiving him for 11 years. I tried to explain that we had done it to protect him and to provide him with a stable, loving home. But Thomas was not interested in our justifications. The most heartbreaking moment came when Thomas asked Rachel why she had given him away if she loved him so much. Rachel tried to explain that she had been young and unable to provide for him, but Thomas wanted to know why she hadn't tried harder to keep him. He asked if she had ever regretted her decision, and whether she had ever wanted him back. Rachel's honest answer that yes, she had sometimes wondered what it would have been like to raise him herself, only made Thomas more upset. He couldn't understand why, if she had regretted giving him up, she hadn't told him the truth sooner, so that he could have had a relationship with her as his mother rather than just as his aunt. The conversation ended with Thomas storming out of the room, saying that he needed time to think and that he didn't want to talk to any of us for a while. I watched him go, feeling like I had just lost the most important thing in my life. The child who had looked at me with such love and trust that morning was gone, replaced by an angry young man who felt betrayed by everyone he had counted on. The weeks that followed our revelation were the darkest period of my life. Thomas barely spoke to any of us, spending most of his time in his room or finding reasons to be away from the house. When he did interact with us, his responses were cold and distant, a stark contrast to the warm, affectionate child he had been just days earlier. At school, Thomas's behavioral problems escalated dramatically. He was getting into fights, skipping classes, and showing a level of anger and defiance that alarmed his teachers. We received multiple calls from the school counselor, who wanted to know what had happened at home to cause such a dramatic change in his behavior. I found myself in the impossible position of having to explain the situation to school officials without revealing too much about our family's private business. I told them that Thomas had recently learned some difficult information about his background and that he was struggling to process it. The counselor recommended that we continue with family therapy and possibly consider individual counseling for Thomas as well. Dr. Martinez was not surprised when we told her what had happened. She had suspected that there was a significant family secret that was affecting Thomas's emotional development, and she had been preparing for the possibility that it would eventually be revealed. She scheduled individual sessions with Thomas and separate sessions with David and me to help us all process the aftermath of our revelation. Thomas's sessions with Dr. Martinez were initially unproductive. He was angry and resistant to talking about his feelings, and he seemed to view the therapy as another form of adult manipulation. He told Dr. Martinez that he didn't trust any of the adults in his life, and that he wasn't interested in working through his emotions with people who had been lying to him for 11 years. Meanwhile, Rachel was struggling with her own guilt and regret about the situation. She had hoped that telling Thomas the truth would help him understand himself better and resolve some of his emotional confusion. Instead, she was watching him become increasingly angry and withdrawn, and she was questioning whether we had made the right decision in revealing the secret. James was also affected by the situation. He had married Rachel, knowing that she had a close relationship with her nephew, but he had not known the true nature of that relationship. Learning that Thomas was actually Rachel's son, and that she had been carrying this secret throughout their entire marriage, was difficult for him to process. He felt deceived by Rachel, and he was struggling to understand why she had not trusted him with the truth. Emma, who was now 6 years old, was confused by the sudden change in family dynamics. She could sense that something was wrong, but she was too young to understand the complexity of the situation. She asked why Thomas wasn't coming to family gatherings anymore, and why everyone seemed sad and angry all the time. The ripple effects of our revelation extended beyond our immediate family. David's parents, who had been thrilled to become grandparents when Thomas was born, were shocked to learn that their grandson was actually their son's nephew. They struggled to understand why we had kept such a significant secret from them, and they were hurt that we had not trusted them with the truth. My own parents were equally confused and upset by the revelation. They had embraced Thomas as their grandson and had developed a close relationship with him over the years. Learning that he was not actually their biological grandchild, while not changing their love for him, raised questions about what other secrets we might have been keeping from our family. The social dynamics in our community also became complicated. Thomas's friends began asking questions about why he seemed so angry and withdrawn. Some of them had overheard conversations between their parents about our family situation, and they were curious about what had happened. Thomas was not ready to talk about the truth, but he was also struggling to maintain normal friendships while dealing with his emotional turmoil. About a month after our revelation, Thomas finally agreed to talk to me directly about his feelings. He came to my room one evening and sat on the edge of my bed, looking older and more serious than any 11-year-old should have to look. He told me that he was struggling to understand who he was and where he belonged, and that he felt like his entire identity had been built on a lie. Thomas asked me difficult questions, about my motivations for keeping the secret. He wanted to know if I had been planning to tell him the truth eventually, or if I had hoped to keep it hidden forever. He asked if I had ever considered how he might feel about being deceived, and whether I had thought about his right to know his own history. I tried to explain that our decision to keep the secret had been motivated by love and a desire to protect him, but Thomas was not satisfied with this explanation. He pointed out that by keeping the truth from him, we had prevented him from having an authentic relationship with Rachel as his mother, and we had forced him to live a lie without his knowledge or consent. The conversation was painful, but it was also the first real communication we had had since the revelation. Thomas was finally willing to express his feelings rather than just acting out his anger, and I was grateful for the opportunity to try to rebuild our relationship, even if it would never be the same as it had been before. Dr. Martinez helped us understand that Thomas's reaction was normal and healthy, even though it was difficult for everyone involved. She explained that children who learn they have been deceived by their parents often go through a period of anger and mistrust before they can begin to rebuild their relationships. She warned us that this process could take months or even years, and that we would need to be patient and consistent in our efforts to earn back Thomas's trust. The healing process was slower and more complicated than any of us had anticipated. Thomas began to show small signs of improvement after several months of therapy, but his relationship with each of us remained strained and complicated. He was most angry with me, as he felt I had been the primary architect of the deception. He was confused about his feelings toward Rachel, torn between anger at her for giving him up and a desire to understand what their relationship could be. Now that the truth was known, David seemed to bear the least of Thomas's anger, perhaps because Thomas understood that David had also been deceived initially, learning about the arrangement after Rachel had already become pregnant. But even David's relationship with Thomas was affected by the revelation. As Thomas questioned whether David's love for him was genuine or whether he had always seen him as a substitute for the biological child he couldn't have, Rachel was struggling with her own complex emotions about the situation. She had spent 11 years suppressing her maternal instincts toward Thomas, and now that the truth was out, she wasn't sure how to navigate her relationship with him. She wanted to be there for him as he processed his feelings, but she also didn't want to disrupt the family structure that David and I had created. James was working through his own feelings of betrayal and confusion. He had married Rachel believing he knew her completely, and learning about such a significant secret made him question what other aspects of their relationship might not be what they seemed. He was also struggling with how to help Emma understand the changes in their family dynamics without overwhelming her with information she was too young to process. Emma was perhaps the most innocent victim of our revelation. She had grown up thinking of Thomas as her cousin, and now she was learning that he was actually her half-brother. She was too young to understand the complexity of the adult relationships that had created this situation, but she was old enough to sense that something fundamental had changed in her family. The extended family was also affected by our revelation. David's parents were hurt that we had kept such a significant secret from them, and they were struggling to understand how they should relate to Thomas now that they knew the truth. My parents were equally confused and upset, feeling that they had been deceived about their grandson's identity. The community response was mixed. Some people were sympathetic to our situation, understanding that we had been trying to do what was best for Thomas in difficult circumstances. Others were more judgmental, questioning our decision to keep such a significant secret, and wondering what other deceptions we might have been maintaining. Thomas's school performance continued to suffer as he struggled to process his emotions. His grades dropped significantly, and he was having difficulty concentrating in class. The school counselor recommended that we consider additional support services, including tutoring and possibly medication for anxiety and depression. About 6 months after our revelation, Thomas began to show signs of curiosity about his biological father. He asked Rachel questions about the man who had gotten her pregnant, wanting to know his name, what he looked like, and whether he knew that Thomas existed. Rachel was reluctant to share this information, as she had no desire to reconnect with someone who had abandoned her when she needed him most. Thomas's questions about his biological father opened up a new area of complexity in our situation. I had never considered the possibility that Thomas might want to know about or even meet his biological father, and I was unprepared for the emotions this possibility stirred up in me. I found myself feeling threatened by the idea that Thomas might want to connect with yet another parent figure who was not me. Rachel eventually agreed to share some basic information about Thomas's biological father, but she was clear that she had no interest in helping Thomas contact him. She told Thomas that his father's name was Michael, that he had been a college student when they met, and that he had made it clear he wanted nothing to do with the pregnancy or the baby. This information seemed to satisfy Thomas's curiosity for the time being, but I could see that he was still processing the implications of having another biological parent out there somewhere. The revelation had already complicated his sense of identity and belonging, and adding the possibility of a biological father he had never met made the situation even more complex. Dr. Martinez helped us understand that Thomas's questions about his biological father were a normal part of his process of understanding his identity. She explained that many adopted children go through a period of wanting to know about their biological parents, and that this curiosity didn't necessarily mean that Thomas was rejecting the parents who had raised him. As Thomas's therapy progressed, he began to express more specific feelings about our deception. He told Dr. Martinez that he felt like he had been living someone else's life, and that he wasn't sure who he really was or where he belonged. He said that he felt angry with all the adults in his life for making decisions about his identity without his input, and that he felt like he had been robbed of the opportunity to have authentic relationships with his biological parents. These revelations were painful for all of us to hear, but they were also helpful in understanding what Thomas needed from us as he worked through his emotions. Dr. Martinez recommended that we focus on rebuilding trust by being completely honest with Thomas about everything, even if the truth was difficult or uncomfortable. This recommendation led to some challenging conversations. Thomas asked us about other secrets we might have been keeping, and we had to admit that there were other family issues we had not discussed with him. He asked about our marriage, about financial difficulties we had experienced, and about conflicts with extended family members that we had tried to shield him from. The process of complete honesty was difficult, but it seemed to help Thomas begin to trust us again. He started participating more actively in family therapy sessions, and he began to show interest in rebuilding his relationships with all of us. However, the process was slow and often involved setbacks when Thomas would become overwhelmed by his emotions and withdraw. Again, one of the most difficult aspects of the healing process was helping Thomas understand that our love for him was genuine, even though our family structure had been built on deception. He struggled to believe that David and I truly loved him as our son, wondering if we had always seen him as a substitute for the biological child we couldn't have. I found myself having to examine my own motivations and feelings more deeply than I ever had before. I realized that while I had genuinely loved Thomas from the moment he was born, my relationship with him had been complicated by my own grief over my infertility and my fear of losing him. I had to learn to separate my love for Thomas from my own emotional needs and insecurities. David went through a similar process of self-examination. He had embraced fatherhood wholeheartedly, but he also had to confront the ways in which his relationship with Thomas had been shaped by his own desire to be a father. He had to learn to love Thomas for who he was, rather than for what he represented in David's life. Rachel was also working through her own complex feelings about the situation. She had to confront the grief and loss she had experienced when she gave Thomas up, while also trying to figure out what role she could play in his life now that the truth was known. She wanted to be there for him without overstepping the boundaries of the family structure that David and I had created. The process of rebuilding our family relationships was complicated by the fact that Thomas was entering adolescence, a time when all teenagers struggle with questions of identity and belonging. The revelation about his adoption had occurred at a particularly vulnerable time in his development, when he was already beginning to question his place in the world. As Thomas's 13th birthday approached, we faced new challenges in figuring out how to celebrate and acknowledge his growth while still working through the aftermath of our revelation. The day that had once been a joyous celebration of his life had become complicated by questions about his identity and our family structure.